After the funeral, the house was eerily quiet with memories of a life lost, weighing heavily on every nook and cranny. I felt more lost than I ever imagined. As I sat by myself at the dining table looking at a half-empty cup of coffee, like a dense, relentless fog, the weight of loneliness enveloped me. I was about to be overwhelmed by the night when I heard a gentle knock on the door. I opened it warily and bewildered to see my son's best friend standing there with something in his eyes that I did not yet understand, but that would alter everything. I got a weird chill the instant I saw him standing there. The porch light made my son's best friend Ben look different. The gaunt teen who would raid our refrigerator and doze off in the living room after playing video games for hours on end was no longer him. His shoulders were broad now, and he stood tall, his face bearing the gravity of a man who had seen the world and felt its weight. We were silent for a moment. Between us, the night air hung heavy with unspoken words. He finally said, "I'm sorry for your loss," in a deeper, more serious voice than I remembered. I nodded at a loss for words. My spouse, my laughter, my sense of community, and now even my voice had all been taken away by grief. Ben moved uncomfortably while clutching a tiny container. "I brought you something," he said, extending a plain, home-cooked casserole. It was a tiny but powerful gesture that broke the flimsy barrier I had erected inside of me. "Thank you," I said in a whisper as I moved to make room for him. Suddenly, as if it were famished for sound and life, the house engulfed him. With a worried expression on his face, he placed the casserole on the kitchen counter and faced me. He asked gently, "How are you holding up?" as his eyes searched mine in a way that, for the first time in weeks, made me feel truly seen. I smiled tightly and without humor. I said, my voice breaking on the word surviving. After a brief moment of hesitation, Ben did something unexpected. He touched my hand. Not in a quick, required manner, but rather in a reassuring, grounding manner that made my chest tremble. Something inside of me resisted my desire to withdraw into my cocoon of grief. I required the connection. A reminder that I was still alive was what I needed. He asked almost shyly, as though he was worried about going too far, "Do you want me to stay for a bit?" I felt the crushing weight of the silence descending once more as I glanced around the deserted house at the picture frames that were still hanging on the walls. "Yes," I replied before giving it much thought. "Please." We entered the living room, a room that was at once cozy and depressing. I curled up on the other end of the couch and pulled a throw blanket over my lap while Ben sat on the edge. We sat there for a few minutes, the only sounds coming from the old house settling and the gentle hum of the refrigerator. He seemed to be a natural link between the life I had lost and whatever uncertain future lay ahead, which was odd. We began by discussing commonplace topics such as his progress at his new job and the neighborhood's changes during his time away at college. The discussion then gradually moved to more complex topics. What I missed most, he inquired, was my husband. Even though it was a straightforward question, it caused me to feel something. I started discussing topics I had suppressed out of concern that they would cause me to break under their weight. I spoke of the quiet mornings, the late-night giggles, and the silent glances that conveyed so much. Without interjecting or attempting to correct anything, Ben listened. My chest ached from the sheer presence and fullness of his attention as he listened. He then leaned forward and said, "You are allowed to miss him and still need someone," when I had finally run out of things to say. I had to briefly close my eyes in order to gather my thoughts because the statement was so honest and painfully true. He was closer than ever when I opened them, his eyes bright but his face shadowed. They were understanding, not sympathetic, just a silent, unspoken gesture of consolation. I briefly had the impression that I was perched on the brink of something lovely and dangerous that had the power to either strengthen or weaken me. Unsure, but somehow willing, my heart pounded in my chest. Nobody had given me that kind of look in such a long time, as if I were wanted rather than pitied. I could feel the electricity in the tiny space between us, and my breath caught. And for the first time in what seemed like an eternity, I gave myself permission to consider the possibility that forgetting was not a necessary part of moving forward. In the ruins of what was lost, what if it meant discovering something fresh, something gentle and restorative? Ben must have noticed how my eyes had changed because he smiled a tentative, slow smile that held 1,000 unspoken promises. My heart pounded. For once I wasn't scared, even though I had no idea where this night was going. I was still here, and I was prepared to feel once more. Ben moved a little, grazing my knee, and the unintentional contact made my breath catch. Moving away, establishing distance, and acting as though the incident had never occurred would have been so simple. However, I didn't. I remained there, allowing the heat to permeate the chilly, empty spaces inside of me where his skin touched mine. He carefully looked into my eyes, giving me every chance to back off and refuse. However, I remained motionless, my heart beating more loudly than I could have said. I instinctively reached out and lightly curled my fingers around his hand. In sharp contrast to the shaky vulnerability I felt within his hand was warm, steady, and slightly calloused. In response, he turned his palm up and entwined his fingers with mine in a gesture so basic yet personal that it caused my throat to constrict. I'd forgotten what it was like to be touched in this way, not out of duty or obligation, but out of genuine presence and concern. Ben moved in closer, filling the gap that still existed between us. He reluctantly and slowly raised his hand to tuck a flyaway hair behind my ear. Even though his fingers only lightly touched my skin, it made me shiver. He just stared at me for a long time, his eyes full of meaning. With a hoarse voice that sounded dangerously close to awe, he whispered, "You are so beautiful." I hadn't heard that from anyone in years, not with that level of unadulterated sincerity. The backs of my eyes ached from the tears, but I blinked them away, not letting them fall. Rather, I allowed his hand to caress my cheek as I leaned into his touch. Before there was only this moment, just him and me and the agonizing possibility between us, the outside world vanished along with the sadness, the loneliness, and the never-ending stream of pointless condolences. I could feel his breath on my lips as he drew closer. He seemed to be giving me one last chance, as there was a pause and a persistent hesitation. However, I didn't want it. I gently pressed my lips to his, closing the distance. At first, the kiss was tentative and gentle, as though we were both worried that the other might back off. But when I cocked my head to strengthen our bond, he answered with such passion that my heart skipped a beat. I felt held, really held for the first time in a long time, as his arms encircled me and drew me against him. As though we were both attempting to make up for lost time, the kiss became more intense and urgent. Feeling the strength beneath his shirt and the solid reality of him grounding me in a way I'd not realized I sorely needed, my hands moved up his chest. He drew back just enough to meet my eyes, trying to find any trace of remorse. However, all he would have discovered would have been longing, an intense, indisputable need to feel alive once more, to be desired, to be noticed. "Are you certain?" His voice was low and rough as he asked. I nodded, unable to speak, and that was sufficient authorization for him. He got up and gently dragged me to my feet before guiding me to the stairs. Every step was heavy with expectation, and every look we exchanged was full of unspoken commitments. My hands were shaking by the time we arrived at my bedroom, but not out of fear, but rather from the overwhelming excitement of what was about to happen. Ben's fingers brushed my skin, leaving trails of fire behind them as he carefully, almost reverently, helped me out of my cardigan. He took his time, as though he wanted to appreciate every part of me, kissing the curve of my shoulder and the hollow of my throat. I reciprocated by stroking his hair and the powerful curve of his back, sensing the tension and release of his muscles as I touched them. My heart ached when he finally laid me down on the bed with such tenderness. For a brief moment, he hung over me, his eyes taking in everything as though he were learning it by heart. He whispered, "You are amazing," and I believed it, if only for tonight, because of the awe in his voice. Slowly and unhurriedly, the rest of our clothing vanished, each item thrown away, as if it represented the loss of past lives and suffering. He touched me with a deep, aching care that left no part of me unseen or unloved, rather than with the clumsy eagerness of youth. Every kiss, touch, and hushed word served as a salve for the wounds I'd kept hidden for so long. The way he looked into my eyes and never once looked away, the way he made me feel like I was cherished rather than broken, was what ultimately broke me, even though our physical connection was electric. In a slow, sensual dance that grew and grew until it engulfed us both, our bodies moved in unison with a rhythm as old as time. I felt a sense of rebirth rather than just release when I finally called his name. It was regaining a piece of myself that I had believed was gone forever. After that, there was a gentle golden silence in the room as we lay entangled together, our breaths evening out. Lazy and gentle, Ben ran his fingers over my arm as though he was hesitant to release his grip. I put my head on his chest and listened to his heartbeat, which was steady below my ear. I was relieved from the oppressive weight of loneliness for a change. Rather, I felt held grounded and warm. "You are no longer alone," he whispered as he planted a kiss on the top of my head. I let the reality of those words sink in as I closed my eyes. Over the course of one night, Ben had shown me that healing was still possible despite its messiness and complexity, and that love could take many different forms. I had been grieving for what was gone for so long that I had lost the ability to hope for what was still there. After so much grief, I finally let myself believe that life could still have unexpected beauty while I was in his arms. And perhaps, just possibly, I was prepared to locate it once more. The tangled sheets and the residual warmth from the previous night were softly illuminated by the morning light as it slowly made its way into the room. Half anticipating that I would wake up alone, half preparing myself for the emptiness that had become my constant companion, I stirred a little. However, Ben remained there, his arm wrapped around me for protection, his breathing steady and slow against my hair. For a brief moment, I let myself just be in the security of that embrace, feeling without question or doubt. But even as my body eased up against his, my mind started to unravel restlessly. As usual, reality demanded recognition. I had been hurt older and had lived through a lifetime of things he could never comprehend. Even though what we had done together the night before had been lovely, almost sacred could it endure, past the flimsy cocoon we had constructed around ourselves in the shadows. My heart was slowly and insidiously filled with cold uncertainty as fear crept in. Sensing my tension, Ben stirred and ran his fingers lightly down my arm. With his voice still heavy with sleep, he whispered, "Penny for your thoughts." Tracing idle patterns on his chest, I grinned pitifully. How could I express my fear to him that, despite his tenderness, a part of me believed this was a fleeting illusion that would be broken by daylight? I was just thinking that last night felt too good to be true, I said, quietly, carefully selecting my words. Ben gently raised my chin so I could look him in the eyes. No hesitancy or glimmer of regret was present, only absolute sincerity. He said firmly that it was real, all of it. My doubts persisted, though. If people knew, what would they think? Would they think I was pathetic, desperate, and clinging to a passing touch to make myself feel less alone? Would Ben wake up, see me more clearly, and know that he deserved a simpler, younger person? As though to protect my heart from the inevitable pain, I pulled the blanket tighter around myself. Ben sat up a little, supporting himself on one elbow, sensing the change in me. "You're overanalyzing once more," he said, smiling softly. "That's what you do when you're afraid." Startled by how easily he read me, I blinked. "Perhaps I'm afraid," I said. "You're young. Your entire life is still ahead of you. You regret your mistake, and I don't want to be." He cupped my cheek as his expression softened. "You are not a mistake," he said, wiping away a tear that I was unaware had fallen with his thumb. "I know no more beautiful or courageous woman than you. It wasn't about filling a void last night. Finding something genuine was the goal. I wanted to think he was real. How I wished I believed him God. However, in the quiet moments, old wounds had a way of whispering lies. I tried to silence the doubtful voices inside of me by pressing my face against his palm and soaking up his warmth. "Now what?" I muttered. "When the outside world returns, when this room is no longer just you and me?" Ben paused, seemingly considering what he would say next. "I don't know everything," he said. "However, I understand how I feel, and I'm not going to leave you or this." His words were like a balm, calming me, but not making the pain of uncertainty go away. Later, there was an unsaid wait between us as we dressed and went about our ordinary morning business. Every involuntary movement of his hand and every prolonged look was tinged with the knowledge that something significant had changed between us. We were more than just two lonely people seeking momentary comfort. Now we were bound together in a way that both alarmed and reassured me. We were both startled by the knock on the door. Ben gave me a quick look and asked me in silence if I wanted him to respond. I smoothed my hair, put on my sweater, and shook my head. They could wait, whoever it was. I needed some time to collect myself and determine how much of the magic from last night I wanted to share with the world. However, I knew deep down that the true struggle was against my own fear, not against other people's opinions. Fear of opening my heart to something I couldn't control, fear of daring to hope, and fear of being vulnerable once more. Ben approached me from behind, putting his chin on my shoulder and his arms around my waist. "We face whatever comes next together," he said softly. His words were straightforward, but they were loaded with a promise I was not even aware I sorely needed. I allowed myself to rely on that promise for the first time in what seemed like an eternity. I allowed myself to believe in the messy, lovely possibility of something real, something worth fighting for rather than in fairy tales or ideal endings. And perhaps, just possibly, that was sufficient. The following days were real, but they were also difficult. There were times when I hesitated, wondered if this delicate relationship between us could last more than that one night, and second-guessed myself. Ben, however, never faltered. He patiently drew me back when I backed away in terror. When I was unsure, he reassured me with straightforward actions and calm words that love does not always come as we expect it to. Sometimes it sneaks through the cracks of a broken heart and plants itself beautifully, stubbornly, and against all odds. We maintained a private relationship, cherishing the little things that only we knew about, like glances across a room, touches that were stolen, and late-night talks that helped to mend the broken pieces of ourselves. Naturally, there were difficulties, but we overcame them together, realizing that our situation was honest, even though it wasn't flawless. I never felt like a burden or an error because of Ben. Not in spite of my scars, but because of them, he gave me a sense of being seen, wanted, and loved. As the sun set and the world turned a gentle shade of gold, Ben took my hand and said, "You saved me too, you know." I realized that perhaps this was about more than just mending old wounds, and I forced a smile through the tears that filled my eyes. We both needed more than we had ever known, but it might have been about creating something new, something neither of us had ever dared to imagine.